Welcome to my Substack, The Myth of the Bloody Ledger, Part 9. What Old Testament sacrifices actually meant. To understand the modern evangelical framework of the cross, you must first accept a very specific assumption about the Old Testament. The altar was an execution block. Penal substitutionary atonement proposes that God's holiness demands violent retribution, framing Levitical sacrifices as a bloody account ledger, where animals receive divine wrath. Therefore, Jesus became the final scapegoat for infinite punishment. It seems logical, but this model contains a fatal flaw. It portrays Israel's God as a pagan deity demanding appeasement. In the ancient Near East, pagan worshippers lived in constant fear of the gods. The gods were fickle, easily offended, and prone to violent outbursts. When disaster struck, it meant the gods were angry, and the only way to pacify them was to offer a sacrifice. You appeased their wrath with the blood and suffering of an animal, or sometimes a human. PSA unintentionally reads this exact pagan framework into the Torah. It assumes the animal on the altar is absorbing the retributive rage of Yahweh. But Israel's sacrificial system was the opposite. It was designed as a radical antithesis of pagan appeasement. The prophets explicitly rejected the idea that God desired blood or suffering to soothe his ego. In Psalm chapter 51 verse 16, David declares, "For you will not delight in sacrifice, or I would give it. You will not be pleased with a burnt offering." If God's justice mechanically demanded a penal substitute to quench his wrath, David's realization makes no sense. The fatal flaw of the PSA reading of Leviticus is its misunderstanding of death. PSA assumes that the death of the animal is the atonement, that the punishment is the point. However, in the Levitical system, death and corpses do not satisfy God's holiness. They contaminate holy space. The high priest was strictly forbidden from even being in the same room as a dead relative, lest he defile his office. If the altar was meant to represent the retributive death blow of God's wrath, the entire system collapses into a contradiction. The animal was not tortured. It was killed swiftly and with dignity away from the altar. What was brought to the altar was the blood. Why? Because Leviticus chapter 17 verse 11 defines blood not as a symbol of death, but as the ultimate symbol of life. "For the life of the flesh is in the blood, and I have given it for you on the altar to make atonement for your souls." The lifeblood was used to purify and cleanse the sacred space from the contamination of human sin, so that God could continue to dwell with his people. It was a mechanism of ritual purification, not a theater of judicial execution. If animal sacrifices were truly functioning as penal substitutes, taking the exact legal punishment the sinner deserved, we would expect the law to allow a murderer to bring a goat to the altar to avoid the death penalty. But the Torah contains no provisions for this. You cannot substitute an animal's life for a capital offense. The sacrifices were never designed to be a one-to-one forensic exchange for a death sentence. The various offerings functioned as ways of restoring the relationship. Burnt offering symbolized surrender and devotion to God. Grain offering, an expression of gratitude and recognition of God's provision. Peace offering, a shared, sacred meal between the worshiper and God, signifying fellowship. Sin/guilt offering, a ritual that cleansed the sanctuary from unintentional defilement and made restitution. The concept is about restoring something to its original state, i.e. the relationship. None of these were designed to appease a wrathful God who demanded a pound of flesh. The last nail in the coffin of the bloody account ledger myth is found in two specific Levitical laws that completely dismantle the mechanics of PSA. First, if God's retributive justice demanded blood to satisfy a penalty, there could be no exceptions. Yet, Leviticus chapter 5 verses 11 to 13 provides a clear concession for the poor. They were permitted to bring 1/10 of an ephah of fine flour as a sin offering to make atonement. If atonement requires penal death, a handful of flour won't work. Second, consider scapegoat, Leviticus chapter 16. In the Old Testament ritual involving the explicit transfer of Israel's sins onto a proxy, the proxy is not executed. The high priest lays hands on the scapegoat, and it is sent away alive into the wilderness. It was an object lesson of removal, physically demonstrating that God was carrying their sins as far as the east is from the west. The Old Testament sacrifices were never a pressure release valve for divine anger. They were beautiful, physical rituals of surrender, thanksgiving, and purification. When Jesus instituted the new covenant, he did not point to a torture device. He pointed to bread and wine. He offered his body and his lifeblood not to satiate the Father's wrath, but to permanently wipe away the defilement of humanity. Christ is the ultimate lifeblood, poured out to finally and fully cleanse the human tabernacle so that the Spirit of God could take up residence and dwell within us. Thanks for listening to my Substack. Remember Proverbs chapter 25 verse 2.